Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. I'm Alex and I'm your host, and today we're exploring how Charles Manson and his followers found their infamous home base, Spahn Ranch, a place that would become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in California history. Picture this. It's 1968, and Manson's family is traveling in an old-school bus that keeps breaking down. When it happens again, one of his followers, Sandy Good, mentions she knows someone who might be able to fix it, someone who lives on a ranch about 35 miles northwest of Los Angeles. What Manson found there would change everything. Spahn Ranch was like stepping into an old TV Western. In fact, that's exactly what it was, a former movie set where many of those classic 1950s cowboy shows were filmed. Imagine hundreds of acres of rugged foothills and mountains, with streams cutting through the landscape and caves dotting the hillsides. At its heart stood a Western town movie set, complete with storefronts and an authentic-looking saloon. The owner was George Spahn, an elderly man in his 80s who could barely see. He made his living renting horses to city folks looking for trail rides, just $1.50 to play cowboy for a day. But the ranch was falling into disrepair, and that's where Manson saw his opportunity. His pitch to Spahn was masterful in its simplicity. Manson and his friends would live there rent-free in exchange for maintaining the movie set and helping with the horses. Manson claimed he had experience with horses from his days working at a racetrack in West Virginia. But here's where it gets darker. He also offered to have his female followers help take care of the elderly Spahn. One of these women was Lynette Fromm. She became Spahn's personal housekeeper, and well, more than that. Spahn gave her the nickname Squeaky because of the high-pitched sounds she'd make when he pinched her. That name would stick with her for the rest of her life. What started as a small group quickly grew. Spahn expected maybe half a dozen people. Instead, within months, there were around 35 family members living on the ranch. Any other squatters who had been there before were gradually pushed out by Manson and his followers. One of the first things Manson did after arriving was put Charles Tex Watson to work building shelters. But here's the fascinating part. Manson wouldn't grant Watson full family membership. He kept him in a sort of psychological limbo, telling him he hadn't surrendered his ego enough to be a true member. So Watson, often high on drugs, worked endless hours just trying to prove himself worthy. The ranch's isolation was perfect for Manson's purposes. Unlike at Dennis Wilson's house, where there were constant visitors and distractions, here Manson could lead his followers into remote canyons and preach for hours. No outside influences, no competing voices, just Charlie's words echoing off the canyon walls. But they weren't alone on the ranch. There was a colorful crew of ranch hands, led by Juan Flynn, a towering Vietnam veteran. Among them was Shorty Shea, who dreamed of making it in movies, and a teenager named Steve Grogan, who the family nicknamed Scramblehead because they thought he was mentally challenged. Ironically, it was Grogan who would become one of Manson's most loyal followers. Let me tell you about a defining moment at the ranch. One day, Flynn, who expected the family to actually work for their keep, got into a confrontation with Manson. Picture this. Flynn, standing over a foot taller than Manson, charging at him in front of all his followers. But Manson didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly lit a cigarette, then held the burning match under his own wrist. As the smell of burning flesh filled the air, he looked Flynn in the eye and said softly, "You know, brother, there's no such thing as pain." Daily life at the ranch was a mix of hard work and indoctrination. The family would make regular trips into Los Angeles, scrounging food from grocery store dumpsters. Manson was still recruiting, but now he was letting his followers do most of the initial work. They'd bring potential members to the ranch, where he could evaluate them in this controlled environment. By late 1968, Manson had developed a sophisticated system for bringing new members into the fold. But here's the thing. No one got in without something to offer. Money, cars, useful skills, Manson always looked for the angle. And if you think getting in was hard, staying in was even harder. New recruits were placed under the supervision of veteran members like Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, or Lynette Squeaky Fromm. Think of it as a twisted sort of apprenticeship. But here's the dark part. If these newcomers only had material possessions to offer, once Manson got what he wanted, they'd find themselves quickly shown the door. One of Manson's most calculating moves was his rule about money. No female family member was allowed to carry any cash, not even pennies. Now, this might sound strange, but it was actually a common control tactic used by pimps. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Without money, women couldn't make a phone call home or buy a bus ticket to escape. During this period, the family kept growing. Among the new arrivals were Catherine Capistrano Gillies and Leslie Van Houten. Van Houten's case was particularly interesting. Initially, Manson wanted to turn her away. She was too intelligent for his liking. Smart people, you see, might question his teachings. But Van Houten had something valuable to offer. She was a skilled secretary who could take shorthand. Manson put her to work recording his song lyrics, even making her spell out the sounds he would make when he wasn't using actual words. In a fascinating twist, a staff member from the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, Alan Rose, spent several weeks at the ranch studying the group. His observations, published later in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, laid bare Manson's methods, using sex to break down inhibitions, stripping followers of their possessions, and maintaining control through a careful balance of preaching, drugs, and exhausting physical labor. The big question Rose and his colleagues couldn't fully answer was, why were these young people, especially the women, so captivated by this disturbed mystic? The day began early at Spahn Ranch, 7 a.m. sharp. First order of business? Taking care of the horses. These weren't just pets. They were the ranch's main source of income, rented out to tourists wanting to play cowboy for a day. One day in 1968, two young boys had rented horses when they heard a guy shouting loudly, "Charlie's up the hill! Charlie's up the hill!" And it startled them. About 20 minutes later, as they were riding up the hill, a trail of horses and riders were coming towards them from the opposite direction. They observed that in the middle of the pack was a little man with dark, dead eyes. He wasn't holding his own reins. The guy in front of him was holding the reins. The little man was staring blankly, his head rocking with the movement of the horse, and as if he was out of his mind. The boys stared intently at the little man, and when they had passed, one of them said to the other, "That must be Charlie." One of those boys went on to become one of the most famous drug dealers in the world, at least in the TV world. It was 12-year-old Bryan Cranston who went on to become the star of the hit show Breaking Bad. After a quick breakfast, usually just leftovers from the night before, the real work began. Some family members would guide trail rides for visitors, while others cleaned stalls and hauled hay. But here's where it gets interesting. When regular chores ran out, Manson would create work just to keep everyone busy. Sometimes it was as pointless as sweeping dust from wooden sidewalks in the movie set, or what some members described as literally digging holes just to fill them again. And if anyone dared complain, they'd face the wrath of the true believers, especially Gypsy or Little Paul, who'd publicly shame them for questioning Charlie's wisdom. The afternoons often took a darker turn. This is when Manson would gather his followers for LSD sessions. Picture this, Manson personally placing tabs of acid on his followers' tongues, though tellingly he often stayed sober himself. While they were tripping, he'd preach about himself as Jesus, sometimes even acting out crucifixion scenes. He called LSD holy, claiming it was the key to discovering your true self. Dinner was a fascinating study in hierarchy. Everyone had to attend, but there was a strict order. Men ate first, women got what was left. Food came from garbage runs, women scavenging from grocery store dumpsters. Sometimes the meals were bizarre. One night they just passed around containers of Cool Whip, everyone licking it off their fingers. But the evenings, this is when Manson's real programming took place. He'd preach, often with his guitar, while the women danced. He loved teaching in parables, like one particularly revealing story about a king and queen that perfectly illustrated his views on gender roles. The message was clear. In Manson's world, women served men. Period. This wasn't just preference. He blamed society's problems on women having too much control. The day would end with music, often Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour played over and over, or the Moody Blues. But increasingly it was Manson performing his own songs, making everyone join in on the choruses. Music played a crucial role in family life. Manson had strict control over what could be played during their evening gatherings. The Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour was in heavy rotation along with the Moody Blues. Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild was the only contemporary hit allowed. Despite his personal appreciation for bands like The Doors and Jefferson Airplane, Manson banned them from these gatherings, a small but telling example of his need to control every aspect of his followers' lives. But music was just the beginning. Manson employed a variety of psychological techniques to maintain his control. One of the most bizarre was what we might call the mirror game. Whenever a family member passed Manson on the ranch's wooden sidewalks, he would stop them and perform a series of facial expressions and hand gestures. The follower had to mirror these movements perfectly. Failure to do so meant you still had too much ego and needed correction. It was a brilliant form of psychological manipulation, simple yet effective. Manson understood the power of both punishment and praise. He had an uncanny ability to sense exactly how much criticism each follower could take before breaking. Just when someone reached their limit, he'd suddenly show warmth. A private walk, a friendly chat, a gentle touch on the shoulder. This cycle of criticism and comfort created powerful emotional bonds. The family also engaged in what Manson called group fantasies, running around the movie set playing cowboys or pirates. Some of the women would pretend to be fairies or elves, and during LSD sessions, Manson would suggest that such transformations might actually be possible someday. These seemingly innocent games served a purpose. They further separated his followers from reality, creating a shared fantasy world where only his rules applied. One of Manson's most radical rules concerned children. He insisted that no child should be raised by their biological parents, even within the family. Every child belonged to everyone. This included his own son with Mary Brunner, known as Pooh Bear, and other children born into the group. When Susan Atkins gave birth, her baby, named Zay Zoze C. Zadfrak, was immediately separated from her. Manson actively encouraged the women to get pregnant, calling it their natural state, though he himself fathered only one child in the group. But the rules went far beyond family structure. Manson banned watches, clocks, and calendars, claiming he wanted his followers to live in the now. Eyeglasses were forbidden. If you couldn't see clearly, well, that was your natural way of viewing the world. Even books were prohibited, with Manson claiming authors were trying to control people's minds, though he, of course, kept a Bible for himself. Perhaps the most revealing aspects of life at the ranch were Manson's contradictions. He presented himself as the reincarnation of Jesus while spouting anti-Semitic rhetoric. He preached that LSD was sacred and should free your mind, yet during group sessions he would physically assault anyone who moved without his permission. When followers noticed these contradictions, Manson had a masterful response. If you saw flaws in his logic, the problem wasn't with him, it was with you. You simply weren't enlightened enough to understand. And his followers accepted this. Even when he beat them, they saw it as a gift, his attempt to make them smarter. Despite his desire to keep the family isolated, Manson did allow some visitors. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys would stop by occasionally, bringing money and spending time with the women. He seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare. Wilson had promised to record Manson's song "Cease to Exist" with the Beach Boys, a glimmer of the musical stardom Manson desperately craved. Charlie knew he was about to make it big, and every visit from Terry Melcher just reinforced that belief. Melcher still wasn't making any promises. He hadn't committed to listening to Charlie's tapes or getting him into a studio, but he was sticking around. That was enough to keep Charlie hopeful and to keep Melcher happy. Charlie played the gracious host. That meant offering up Ruth Ann, his favorite girl, for Melcher's pleasure. The other family women were available too, but Ruth Ann was his first choice. Greg Jacobson came around too, usually with Melcher or Dennis Wilson. He still believed there was something marketable about Charlie. Maybe not his music, but him. Maybe a documentary, maybe something for TV. So Jacobson spent time studying him, walking the ranch with Charlie, asking about his past, and Charlie was more than happy to tell his story. The illegitimate son of a teenage prostitute, beaten and abused in reform school and prison, forced to play the insane game to survive, able to change hats at will, adapting to any situation, any crowd, and Jacobson watched him do it. Charlie was firm yet fatherly with the family, obsequious with George Spahn, a buddy and musical equal with Wilson and Melcher, and with the bikers, a crude redneck pal. Charlie liked having the bikers around sometimes. They were useful, good at fixing motorcycles, and the family always had a couple of busted bikes. But there was a problem. Bikers liked beer, and Charlie banned alcohol. He said it was mind-numbing, not mind-expanding like LSD. But if bikers were coming over, Charlie expected the family to find some beer, somehow. They'd panhandle for it, they'd steal for it, but shoplifting a case of beer? Even Charlie knew that was risky, so they begged instead. And sex was part of the routine. Charlie would bring over whoever he wanted to impress. Not just Wilson, Melcher, and Jacobson. Bikers, drug dealers, and then he'd line up the family women in front of them. Pick one. And whichever girl was chosen, Charlie ordered her to go. To do whatever was asked of her. If she hesitated, if she refused, that meant she still had hang-ups, and Charlie punished her for that. Sometimes by making her strip naked in front of everyone. Then humiliating her, breaking her down. The lesson was simple. Don't refuse, don't hesitate, and above all, never seem reluctant. Charlie loved showing off in front of his VIPs, especially his music. One day, he, Wilson, and Jacobson were walking the ranch, and the place reeked of horse manure, and there was flies everywhere. Charlie just stood there, swarmed by them, guitar in hand, and started playing a song about the flies, their buzzing, and what it all really meant. Jacobson had seen a lot of musical genius, even Brian Wilson. But Charlie had something different. Something raw, something improvised. Years later, Jacobson would say, Charlie could have been a rapper, spitting street gospel over a beat. But in that moment, Charlie wasn't focused on rap. He was focused on one thing: fame. And right now, he was still working Wilson, Melcher, and Jacobson, because Universal hadn't come through for him. And Charlie wasn't about to let this dream slip away. One day, Phil Kaufman showed up at Spahn Ranch, but Charlie wasn't impressed. Kaufman had nothing to offer. No record deal, no connections, just friendship. And Charlie didn't need that, so the family ignored him. Cold shoulders all around. After an hour, Kaufman got the message and left. He figured that was the last he'd ever see of Charlie and his so-called peace and love followers. He thought, at least they weren't hurting anyone. They were selfish, sure, but harmless, or so it seemed. The authorities knew about the hippies at Spahn Ranch. They were just another commune, one of hundreds around Los Angeles, long-haired, preaching peace, dropping acid. Law enforcement didn't love them, but they had bigger problems to worry about. And who was supposed to keep an eye on Spahn Ranch anyway? The place sat right on the LA-Ventura County line. Neither department wanted to claim it, so nobody did. And that meant Charlie and the family were left alone, free to do whatever they wanted. I'll be back after this quick break. Charlie controlled what the family knew about the outside world. He fed them select bits of news, but only what he thought they should hear. And 1968 gave him plenty of fuel. August 26th. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Protests, tear gas, baton swinging, network cameras capturing the chaos. And protesters, choking and bleeding, chanting, "The whole world is watching." And after that, America seemed to fracture. Some radicals still pushed for peaceful change, but others, they wanted war. Meanwhile, Nixon was preaching law and order, and voters, frightened and exhausted, turned to him. On November 5th, he won, and the country braced for what was coming next. Across the Atlantic, the Beatles were in the studio. They were fighting. McCartney wanted ballads, but Lennon wanted edge. But this time, Paul brought the grit. A loud, wild song about a British carnival ride, HelterSkelter. Little did he know the impact that song would have more than 5,000 miles away in Los Angeles. 2 days later in L.A., the Beach Boys were recording too. Dennis Wilson had taken Charlie's song Cease to Exist. He changed the words and changed the meaning and rebranded it as Never Learn Not to Love and credited himself as the sole songwriter. Charlie would be furious when he found out. But Dennis, he figured Charlie owed him. A summer of freeloading, a totaled Ferrari. And besides, Dennis was a beach boy, Charlie was a nobody. That's how L.A. worked. And if Charlie wanted to make it in the industry, he'd have to learn who was boss. But Charlie had bigger concerns. Spahn Ranch wasn't isolated enough. Too many distractions and too many ways for people to leave. Bikers gave rides into town. Guests were invited to stay the night without permission. And one morning, Charlie had to chase off a guy who'd spent the night with Leslie Van Houten. The next day, the guy came back, this time with friends. And right in front of Charlie, he told Leslie, "You should leave with us." She stayed, but what if she hadn't? What if others followed? Charlie's power depended on control. He had 36 followers now, and he was done recruiting. He told little Paul, Watkins, and Gypsy no more new members unless they had money or resources. What he wanted was a new home, somewhere farther from civilization, where he could be the only influence. Somewhere like Grandma's place. That's what family member Kathy Gillies called it, a ranch deep in Death Valley, hard to reach, even by car. Charlie took a trip to check it out, and what he saw was exactly what he'd been looking for. No distractions, no escape. Just Charlie and his family. The desert loomed like serrated teeth, a wild, harsh land. Scattered settlements in Inyo County, Trona, Shoshone, were barely outposts. Independence, the county seat, wasn't much better. The closest town, Ballarat, was a ghost town, except for a bare-bones general store, the only place to buy necessities. Wildlife thrived, but humans did not. Fewer than 2 people per square mile. Most were drifters, prospectors hoping for gold. The ones who stayed? Iconoclasts, people who wanted nothing to do with the outside world. Law enforcement was scarce, just a handful of county officers and Death Valley rangers. Mostly, desert dwellers were left alone, just the way Charlie wanted it. Some places in the desert were livable, if not luxurious. Underground streams meant wells and irrigation were possible. Kathy Gillies' relatives had made their ranch almost attractive, with vegetable gardens and well-kept buildings. But Charlie had his eye on the land next door. Barker Ranch. 2 stone houses, a shed, a small pool for water, a generator for limited electricity 50 miles from the nearest power lines, a wood stove, a bathroom. 50 miles from civilization might as well have been the far end of the world. Charlie tracked down Arlene Barker, the owner. He told her he was a musician looking for solitude. To prove it, he handed her a Beach Boys gold record, stolen from Dennis Wilson's lodge. That was enough. She let him stay. Most of the family moved in. Charlie left a few at Spahn Ranch. Almost immediately, the family hated it. Blistering heat, worse than Spahn. No phones, no radio, snakes and scorpions under every rock. Cooking meant chopping wood, awful work in the sun. Charlie shut them down. Soon, things in the outside world will turn to chaos, full-out war, and young loves like you will be targets, but out here, we're safe. The family didn't buy it, so Charlie gave them something else to believe in. A hidden hole, a magical entrance to underground tunnels, a way to anywhere on Earth. "We'll find it," he told them, tripping on acid. And they wanted to believe. Reality was harsher. No grocery stores, no easy food runs. Charlie sent the women to forage in the desert. They didn't know how. You're women. This is what you're supposed to know. But they came back empty-handed. Food had to be bought, either at Ballarat's tiny general store or hauled in from LA or Vegas. Travel was brutal, money was scarce. Charlie tried sending the girls to Vegas to panhandle. For an Indian tribe, they told tourists. It worked, but barely. And Vegas was a risk. Too many outside influences, too much temptation. Charlie had dragged them to the desert to escape all that. Now he had another problem. In LA, acid and weed were easy to find. Bikers, dealers, Charlie had things to trade, motorcycles, beadwork, sex. In Death Valley, nothing. And Charlie needed LSD to keep the family under control, weed to smooth over the frustration. Barker Ranch had its advantages, but food and drug shortages tipped the scales. Spahn was easier. Charlie had convinced his followers that Barker Ranch was their new promised land. If he suddenly changed course, they might doubt him. He needed a reason to leave, and just before Thanksgiving, Dennis Wilson gave him one. Dennis Wilson didn't hold grudges. Charlie's song Cease to Exist had been reworked. It was now titled Never Learn Not to Love, and Dennis took full credit. But the song turned out well. Maybe Charlie would be happy just to hear his music recorded. Maybe this could be the start of something. More collaboration? More money? Dennis still liked the girls. He knew Charlie had moved to Barker Ranch. So, toward the end of November, he and Greg Jacobson decided to visit. They arrived to an enthusiastic welcome. Wilson, carefully editing the details, told Charlie that his song had made it onto the new Beach Boys album. They should head back to LA to celebrate. Charlie was elated. He couldn't afford to be away from LA at such a critical moment. Surely, once the industry elite heard Cease to Exist on the album, titled 2020, they would recognize its brilliance and rush to sign its creator. The family had to return to Spahn immediately. Of course, he didn't frame it that way to his followers. Instead, he warned them of Death Valley's brutal winters, just as harsh as its summers. The buildings weren't heated, and out of concern for their well-being, he was leading them back to LA. They could return to Barker Ranch after winter. Everyone was relieved. No one more than Charlie. Wilson and Jacobson spent the night at Barker. Wilson had free rein with any of the girls. Jacobson, however, wanted his Jeep back, which irritated Charlie. To make a point, Charlie denied him Ruth Ann and instead offered Leslie. Jacobson was briefly indignant, but gave in. Leslie was beautiful and sweet. The next morning, Wilson, Jacobson, and Charlie headed back to L.A., with most of the family following shortly after. Charlie left a few members behind to stake the family's claim on the property. A problem arose immediately. Squeaky asked George Spahn if the family could return to Spahn Ranch, assuming his answer would be yes. Instead, Spahn refused. He had decided that the long hairs made the place look bad. Charlie, consumed by dreams of imminent stardom, had no patience to argue. The old man allowed a few members to stay. He wasn't ready to give up Squeaky's attentions, but the rest had to find another place. Charlie secured a 2-story house on Gresham Street in Canoga Park, above Topanga. They had enough money to rent it for a couple of months. The family moved in, waiting for 2020 to drop in January. Big things were coming. Meanwhile, the women kept up with garbage runs, and the men worked on cars. If they returned to Death Valley, Charlie reasoned, they'd need vehicles suited to the terrain. Tex and the others began converting cars into dune buggies. Charlie preached, oversaw acid trips, and spent nights soaking in the hot tub while Leslie read to him from Revelation. He was obsessed with its imagery, weaving it into his sermons. Increasingly, he referred to himself as the second coming of JC, Jesus Christ. He had the family bleat like sheep, the good shepherd leading his flock, and they did. Charlie didn't just interpret the Bible for his followers, he wielded it as a weapon. Though they revered and feared him, some of his decrees stirred quiet dissent, especially among the women when he reinforced their subservience. He shut them down with Scripture. Like a fundamentalist preacher, he declared that if it was in the Bible, it was truth, beyond debate. To question him was to question the Word of God. He was J.C. reborn. Later, former family members would scoff at claims that they had practiced Satanism. Charlie saw himself as Jesus returned to Earth. Satan was not an ally. He was the enemy. Keeping the family occupied in the city was harder than at Spahn or Barker Ranch, but just as they returned to L.A., the Beatles released their new album, a sprawling double-disc set. Twice as many songs to obsess over, twice as much meaning to unravel. Officially titled The Beatles, its stark, featureless cover was a jarring contrast to the swirling psychedelia of Magical Mystery Tour. Almost immediately, the world gave it another name, the White Album. More about the Beatles after this quick break. In the late 1960s, Charlie Manson was obsessed with the Beatles' White Album. To him, it was more than just music. It was a prophetic roadmap to the future. The White Album, with its 30 exceptionally eclectic songs, was a product of internal squabbles within the band. Despite these tensions, the album received critical acclaim, but many listeners found it lacking in consistency and theme. Manson, however, saw something that others did not. He gathered the family around at the Gresham Street rental house and had them listen to the White Album over and over. He demanded that they pay special attention to the songs Piggies, Blackbird, Revolution 1, Revolution 9, and HelterSkelter. Each of these songs had a specific meaning in Manson's twisted vision. Piggies described the disgusting sense of entitlement enjoyed by the very rich and powerful, concluding that they needed a damn good whacking. Blackbird predicted an uprising of the downtrodden blacks. This was the moment for them to arise. Revolution 1 was a call to arms. Revolution 9, with its electronic effects and sound bites including the clatter of machine guns and human screams, was the soundtrack of the coming fury. And HelterSkelter provided a formal name for the chaos soon to come. Manson made certain that his followers felt these interpretations were theirs as well as his. He asked for their comments about the songs, then wove whatever they said into a larger context. Everyone should feel incredibly proud, Manson declared. Not only was the White Album the Beatles' collective call to arms to the entire world, but it was specifically directed toward Charlie and the family. Sometime in 1969, the family would return to Barker Ranch in Death Valley, and the Beatles would join them there. Manson determined this based on a line in the song Honey Pie that referred to crossing the Atlantic. With his usual assumption of superiority and entitlement, Manson felt certain that the Beatles would come to him and his followers. To get the process underway, he sent letters and telegrams of invitation to the Beatles' office in England. There was no response, but Manson wasn't deterred. The Beatles were only part of the truth he now revealed. He preached to the family that a black uprising was imminent, not just because the Beatles said so, but also because the Bible prophesied it. In fact, the Bible predicted not only the uprising, but also the Beatles themselves and Charlie Manson. The Revelation to John, the final book of the New Testament, concludes the Christian Bible on an unsettling apocalyptic note. John writes about what he has learned to a series of Christian communities so they will have some warning of what is about to happen. For some Christians, Revelation is entirely symbolic. To others, it's a literal account of what is going to occur. Manson explained that Revelation predicted that locusts would come, and locusts were, of course, Beatles. The Beatles. John said that the locusts would have scales like iron breastplates. According to Manson, these were the Beatles' guitars. And there was more. Revelation also told of angels coming to Earth, with the first four being the Beatles. The fifth, given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit, was Charlie. The bottomless pit was the hole in the Death Valley desert, the one Charlie had already told the family about. Revelation and the White Album, with assistance from Charlie, made it clear. There was about to be an uprising of the oppressed in the world, mostly the blacks, who had been held down for too long. Everybody had a turn in power, and now it was going to be black people's turn. Something called HelterSkelter, an event or events still to be determined, would set off the battle. The blacks were going to kill most of the whites and enslave their surviving oppressors, which was only fair. Whites had made blacks their slaves, and now roles would reverse. But here was the kicker. Just as the Bible foretold, and the Bible was always right, Charlie would lead the family to the bottomless pit, where they would remain in hiding as the world above descended into chaos. After a while, it didn't matter how long, because time didn't matter, hundreds of years perhaps, the family would expand to 144,000, the equivalent of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the number specified in Revelation 14:3. Meanwhile, blacks would discover that they lacked the intelligence and organizational skills to run the world. So Charlie and the family would emerge from the bottomless pit and become acknowledged rulers. Charlie, of course, the first among them. He'd already convinced many of his followers that he was Jesus reincarnated. It didn't take a much greater leap of faith to buy into this new vision. Charlie stressed that everyone had all the proof that they needed: Revelation and the White Album. The family was overwhelmed by this news. Charlie maintained rigid control with his usual methods of carrot and stick. The women in particular were reminded that if they remained loyal while they were down in the pit living in a wonderful underground city, they could change into any creature they wished. Several wanted to become winged elves, and Charlie promised that when the moment was especially near, they'd begin to feel budding wings growing on their backs. But a terrible fate awaited anyone trying to leave the family now, he cautioned. All of them were white, and any deserters who weren't killed in the coming racial cataclysm would undoubtedly be made into slaves serving black masters. Their choice was slave or ruler. There was an unexpected defector. Tex Watson, previously one of Charlie's most compliant followers, suddenly found family membership claustrophobic and sneaked away. He stayed in the LA area, though, supporting himself by dealing drugs in tandem with a new girlfriend. Through the bikers, Charlie had an excellent network of informers, and probably soon knew exactly where Tex was. Charlie wasn't in a hurry to reclaim him. While most of the family was preoccupied with the new prospect of HelterSkelter, Charlie also had to concern himself with his long-anticipated breakthrough as a musician. The Beatles' double-disc set was fine, but Charlie's album, the one that producers would beg him to record after the Beach Boys' version of Cease to Exist was released, would surpass the White Album both commercially and as a harbinger of the future. Charlie expected Cease to Exist to appear on the Beach Boys' album 20, which reached stores on January 27, 1969. But the band chose to precede 2020 with several singles from the album. The second single, released in December 1968, had Bluebirds Over the Mountain as its A-side and Cease to Exist on the B-side, completely reworked as Never Learn Not to Love, with Dennis Wilson credited as sole composer. Charlie had no inkling of this until he heard the record, and when he did, he exploded. To him, it was betrayal of the rankest sort. He'd told Wilson that it was all right to make changes to the music, but the lyrics must not be changed in any way. Wilson knew he wasn't supposed to do it. He did it anyway, and he didn't tell Charlie that he had. The insult was compounded by the fact that Bluebirds Over the Mountain, Never Learn Not to Love tanked on the singles charts, stalling out at number 61. If the record had been a smash, Charlie still might have gained some recognition from producers for the genesis of a hit, if not the final version of it. As it turned out, Charlie was the uncredited composer of a failed song, and in the bottom-line world of the recording industry, that was more damning than not having a song recorded at all. In his rage, it would have been natural for Charlie to seek revenge on Wilson, but he somehow managed to keep himself under control. Dennis Wilson was a traitor, and clearly he could not be trusted as a songwriting collaborator, let alone as a dedicated promoter of Charlie's music career. That Wilson had honestly tried for months to get Charlie a record deal, or that he'd opened his home to Charlie and the family, meant nothing. At some level, Charlie interpreted such generosity as personal weakness. He had the veteran hustler's scorn for gullible marks. But his ambition dwarfed any other consideration. Though Wilson had dealt a blow to Charlie's plans, to the fame and glory that Charlie not only craved but was certain he deserved, he still needed him in one critical way that precluded Charlie from immediately getting even. By December 1968, Charlie had been working connections in the LA music scene for almost a year. During that time, he had auditioned his music for Gary Stromberg at Universal, who turned him down. Brother Records wanted no part of him. Greg Jacobson was still trying to help, but he was more interested in making a movie about the family than in getting Charlie a record deal. Now, Dennis Wilson was a dead end, too. Making even one of these contacts would have been beyond the grasp of almost all of the other would-be rock stars who flocked to LA daily. Charlie had enjoyed far more than his share of access, and it still came to nothing, with one remaining exception. Though Terry Melcher still hadn't listened to Charlie's tapes, let alone audition Charlie in person, he hadn't refused to either. He'd made a few social visits to the family at Spahn, though these were mostly to enjoy the girls, Ruth Ann especially, rather than hang out with Charlie. It had taken Charlie a while, but he finally understood the recording industry food chain. Initially, he'd believed that all it took to get signed was the support of rock stars like Dennis Wilson or Neil Young, but the endorsement of celebrities meant little compared to the clout enjoyed by the most successful producers. And no producer in town was more successful than Melcher. If Melcher said so, Charlie had a record deal at Columbia, one of the most prestigious labels. Along with Greg Jacobson, Dennis Wilson was Melcher's best friend. If Charlie went off on Wilson, physically attacking or even just verbally tearing into him, that would surely result in Melcher terminating any potential interest in Charlie. As hard as it might be, Charlie had to keep getting along with Wilson, had to let his betrayer think that everything was still okay between them, until Melcher finally gave Charlie a chance. And if he got that chance, Charlie was certain this time everything would go the way that he wanted. In the next episode, we find out that Charlie is starting to lose control, and the violence that the Manson family became famous for begins. But in the meantime, here is Simon and Tom to give us their thoughts on this episode.
Tom and I speak about you every week because of the work that you're doing here. It really is astonishing. It's the amount that you've had to sift through to get to that detail. Firstly, are you enjoying it? And secondly, how do you go about that? It must be an onerous task.
Thank you, Simon. For sure it's a lot of work, but I'm still enjoying it. There are thousands of books, websites, YouTube videos, and newspaper articles about this case, and I have spent many hours listening, watching, and reading about it. A few years ago, like most people, including yourselves, I thought I knew about the so-called Manson murders, but it turned out I knew very little. I think my interest was piqued when, a few years ago, I was watching a documentary about Laurel Canyon and the incredible music scene there in the late 60s, and the name Bobby Beausoleil was mentioned, and that he was connected to Manson and his followers, and of course Manson played a part in the story too. So I started to do a bit of research on the subject, and the more I learned, the more fascinated I became. The whole story is just incredible. We have just finished episode 7, and none of the crimes that they became infamous for have even happened yet, but that's coming soon. What about you, Tom? Are you enjoying it?
I'm really enjoying now as you're building the picture and the psychological profiles coming together. It's a fantastic piece of work. Well done, very well done, and keep it going.
I'm looking forward to the next few episodes when things come to a head for the family here.
Episode 7 was wonderful because we're starting to see the breakdown in the plan and the drift towards violence. And we're starting to see what was perfectly rational actions on behalf of Charlie turn to being irrational. I wonder whether that's to do with a specific drug. Now, let me explain just for a second. Up to now, his plan has made sense. He's gathering his gang together, he's selecting the people in his gang, he's weeding out the people who would be a threat to him, he's weeding out the people who are no use to him, he's moving them around purposefully to keep control, he's stripping them of their identity and giving them pet names so that they don't identify with their old thing. He's preaching to them, and so he's controlling them absolutely. And all of a sudden, he starts to be irrational. He starts to have a paranoia about the Black Panthers. He starts to talk about HelterSkelter, which is utter nonsense when you think about it. I wonder, Alex referred to the use of the drug mescaline. Now, I don't know, did you ever come across mescaline in your time?
Yes, I did.
We came across little bits and pieces of it, but when I was out in America working, I worked with a guy from the DEA who was one of the authorities on mescaline. And what he told me was often mescaline looks like LSD. The symptoms are like LSD, but he said that mescaline is very much more dangerous because it's a natural substance and therefore people take it in huge dosages. Very popular amongst the biker community. That's where we find it, among our biker community.
Yep.
But one of the side effects of mescaline use is paranoia and schizophrenic behaviour. Alex, I'd really like to know about Charlie's use of mescaline. You've made it very clear that sometimes he stayed sober, in your words, not taking LSD to keep control, but mescaline has completely different properties. That was an interesting point. I wonder, because right now Charlie's behaviour is going off the scale, from being rational, from being controlling, albeit in an evil way. He was logical, and now he's starting to behave in an entirely illogical way.
Tom, I have never heard about mescaline being used by Charlie, but as you say, it looks like LSD, so he could have been taking it in front of others who thought it was LSD, or he could have been taking it privately in the absence of others. I'll watch out for any evidence as I continue my research. Simon, what are your thoughts on Manson and the drugs?
It's the underlying factor here that's keeping the group together, really, because he's making sure there's hallucinogens available all the time. It becomes part of the daily ritual that they're all taking drugs. The fact that he's opting out now and again tells you the quantity that they must be using as well. His music, all the preaching, everything that he's done is underpinned with this use of LSD. He doesn't like alcohol. He says that's mind-numbing, whereas LSD is freeing of the mind. So I think there's that whole underpin. And I know that I talk about it quite often, but I can see the war on drugs now from a different perspective because of what Alex is doing with the Charles Manson era in late 60s America and the world. And the overriding thing that brought about the war on drugs was fear. When Nixon was elected at the end of the 60s, he was elected on a law and order ticket because people were scared. They were scared of the hippie movement. They were scared of the communes that were springing up. They were scared of drug use. They were scared of the racial undertones that they were being fed and that black people were now mixing with white people freely. All of these things, including on a world scale, the wars that were going on, primarily in Vietnam. That's why the answer was to try and clamp down on these things, because they were undermining society.
Yeah, they were frightened of the counterculture, weren't they?
I think you're right there, Tom.
And you can see why when you see the violence there was in some of these demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations, and the fury unleashed. It was almost as if the youth of America was turning against the middle-aged, the sort of ruling generation, and the catalyst for that was drugs, or was seen to be drugs.
Yes. Tom, the other thing in this episode that I wanted to speak to you specifically about, because this has changed in the police so much over the last 50 years, was jurisdiction. There were hundreds of these communes like Charlie's family springing up all over California from what the picture that's been painted for us. Law enforcement would be struggling to deal with that. And when you bring in the different jurisdictions that exist, I'm thinking back to my days with Strathclyde when we had 8 forces in Scotland and jurisdiction posed a problem. Because of your historical knowledge, you'll be able to allude to a time when there were hundreds of forces in Scotland because we're all tiny forces in their own right. The jurisdiction problems helped Manson stay under the radar here, didn't they?
They did, but we never had jurisdictional problems like the United States did. The United States was riven by jurisdictional problems, and I saw that when I worked out there, because you had several layers of law enforcement in every place.
Wow, hold on a minute, Tom. Did you work for the FBI out here?
I did. I haven't spoken about it much, but yes, I did. That was one of the problems they had, actually, was because of all the jurisdictional issues, the turf wars. They were often not called in and not notified until it was too late. It was to try and build relationships with local law enforcement. That was the reason I was at the FBI Academy. They got local police chiefs and brought them to Quantico And then they brought some exotic foreign detectives in. I was an exotic foreign detective.
I've heard you called a few things because you
Yeah.
did command a force of 3,500. So I've
Yeah.
heard you called a few names, and I've thought of a few myself over the last year or so. But exotic has never been one that's actually come to mind.
That's exotic, not erotic.
Well, I know that.
Let's get that right. If only. No, but seriously, turf wars and jurisdictions problems were always, you have your town police, sheriff, state police, then you had the DEA and the FBI, alcohol, tobacco and firearms, ATF. It was the ATF who were responsible for some of these huge shootouts against these communes of people. All of these people, all protecting their turf. We had some jurisdictional issues in Scotland, but they were at the margins because we knew where our boundary lay. And the truth of the matter, in the Strathclyde area, there was only one police force. It was Strathclyde Police.
Yes.
There was not Strathclyde Federal Authority. There was not Strathclyde Town Sheriff. There was not Hamilton Police Department and Glasgow Police. No, there was only the police.
Yeah.
And even going back further than that, I mean, I've done a lot of work looking into some of the famous crimes, the Ruxton murders in particular, back to 1935, 90 years ago this year, actually. Even then, when we had myriad small forces, there was still an understanding that some of these small forces did not have the wherewithal to deal with certain crimes. That was the beauty of it, because immediately the body parts were found in tiny Dumfriesshire that had 70 officers and no CID. The chief constable there knew exactly who to call, and he called Percy Sillitoe in Glasgow, and he in turn acted to get fingerprints and photographers from Edinburgh and got very good detectives. You had very good detectives in Glasgow at that time in 1935, Simon. I mean, I don't know what happened since then, but in these days you did. And they made their way there. So it all came together. There was a very clear understanding about what was possible and what was not. Unfortunately, in many parts of the United States, and I can't speak for now because I'm a few years out of date, this was a huge problem. And you see this coming forward in the Manson case, where you had a group of people who were highly suspicious, operating on the margins, living on petty crime, with all sorts of odd people involved. And no doubt some of Charlie Manson's acolytes, some of his family were probably wanted on warrants by different places. No doubt they were all people who should have been on the radar, and they were not on the radar because of jurisdiction. And as you've said, and you're right about this, Simon, back then in the LA area, because of the tremendous draw of show business and wealth and glamour, you must have had thousands of kids making their way from all over the United States and other parts of the world to get to LA, where the streets were paved with gold. And as we now know, as we go forward, it was far from that.
Episode 7. Of course, it starts with the Spahn Ranch, George Spahn's ranch. And a lot of it is about Charlie trying to find the right place, because it's all about the environment. It's about isolation. It's about cutting the family off from outside influences. It's about keeping them cocooned. They're not allowed phones or newspaper or television, anything like that. As you say, their identities are moulded to suit him. That's all going on, and he's moving back and forward, looking for places to stay. And then towards the end of the episode, we start to hear, and this is his slide into the HelterSkelter that you alluded to there, and it was really the Beatles. After the Magical Mystery Tour, which he was obsessed by, then it comes into the White Album, or just the Beatles album as it was called, but became the White Album, with the tracks on that, Revolution, etc., that we'll talk about next time. We'll talk about more now that we're coming to this stage of the story. And I suppose the final part of that is this underlying, Charlie wants to be famous. He thinks he should be famous. The LSD's done one thing to him, and it's made him think that he's good, hasn't it?
It has. It's funny, because I've listened to his singing and his playing, and back then it was all about appearance, and there was such an appetite for recorded music that these record producers were putting people on the stage and pushing them forward to fame when their talent, as we know, some of the early boy bands and pop groups couldn't play their instruments at all. They were all presentable, they were all good-looking guys. I'm thinking of the Monkees, particularly that band that came up, very famous band. That was a completely artificial construct, just on the fact that they looked the part. I think I said the last time, Charlie Manson perhaps could have broken through, and the whole history would have been different. These are things that intrigue me. It's points of departure. It's where things could have been different, and what was the catalyst.
Brilliant, Tom. The detail is incredible, and putting it in context is a fantastic job, Alec. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Simon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell this story on your fabulous podcast. In the next episode, Charlie makes a crucial mistake which starts a chain of events that eventually leads to his downfall.